Hello, bookworms. Welcome to The Best Book Ever, the podcast where we talk about your favorite books. I'm your host, Julie Strauss, and today I'm so excited to talk to my friend, Alyssa Archer. Alyssa is a homesteader, a homeschooling mother of three, a novelist, a degenerate poker player, her description, not mine, and a little obsessed with personality typing systems. She lives on a 5-acre homestead in a tiny town in the Texas Hill Country with her husband, 3 children, 3 dogs, 2 cats, 15 chickens, and several thousand bees. She writes the Hill Country Cozy Mystery series under the pen name Lucy Jackson. When I invited Alyssa onto the show, I knew she was going to choose a fantasy book because we've been friends for a long time and I know epic fantasies are her jam. What I did not expect was how much I would like her choice. I'm so excited for you to hear Alyssa tell me why Deerskin by Robin McKinley is the best book ever. The indie bookstore spotlight of the week is Alyssa's all-time favorite, Powell's New and Used Books in Portland, Oregon. Powell's is the largest indie bookstore in the world and also one of the most popular in the United States. Since we can't visit right now, go to their website, powells.com, Powells.com, and check out the tab entitled What I'm Giving for a really fun roundup of what some of your favorite authors are gifting their friends and family this year. The Powell's website also has a fantastic staff picks section. One of the picks happens to be The Magical Language of Others by E.J. Koh, a book that was the topic of the Best Book Ever podcast, episode 23, one I highly recommend you listen to if you haven't already. Powell's has a literary book club subscription box, which would be a great gift, a kids' book subscription box, and so much more. As always, this is not a paid ad or sponsorship. All of the book links in my show notes support independent bookstores. Please consider doing your holiday shopping at a store run by real book people, not one run by algorithms. Now, back to the show. Hi, Alyssa. Welcome to the Best Book Ever podcast.
Thank you, Julie. It's so great to be here.
It's always so fun to talk to you. I'm going to start right off with one of my favorite things to talk to you about, which is that you are a homesteader. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about what you and your family have done?
I can. Let's see. So this story goes back a little bit to when I met my future husband. And within a few days, he had let me know that one of his lifetime dreams was to have 10 acres, goats, and peaches in the hill country of Texas. We were living in Austin at the time. My accent's going to get deeper as I talk about this. And I was like, oh my, that sounds like a lot of work. So that was 13 years ago. And 3 years ago, I was realizing that Austin had gotten a lot bigger and I was not enjoying city life. I actually had tickets to Austin City Limits one year and I drove down to go and I was so overwhelmed by the cars and the people that I just turned around and went home. And I'm like, that year or the following spring, I took my daughters to an art camp in the hill country on the Guadalupe River. And it was so peaceful and beautiful. And, it's just gorgeous country out here. And it reminded me of my husband's dream. And I got home that weekend and my property tax bill was waiting for me in the mail. And I realized how much we were spending to live in Austin. And I started looking for real estate. And so it took us about 6 months, but I found 5 acres in the hill country that we could buy outright. And so now we are mortgage free in a ramshackle little mobile home that we're renovating room by room. And it's taken 2 years longer than I thought it would at this point. But it's been great. Yeah, we started with bees. That was our first addition to the property. So I've got 2 beehives. And then we started doing broiler chickens, which was meat chickens that you process so that you can have chicken dinners. And then we added laying hens. So now we have chickens on the property that are giving us eggs every day. And then in March, when the pandemic hit, we had been planning to start a garden in the fall of 2020. But in March, my little brain said, we're starting that garden right now. And so that's been a lot of my time. That's where my time's been going lately, is to those gardens and to learning about gardening. And oh boy, I thought I had a black thumb, but it turns out all you have to do is learn stuff and apply it. Anyway, I hope that.
And when you say broiler chickens, you're not talking about one chicken a month or anything like that. Like you have what do you call it? A crop? A flock? A flock, of course.
Oh, I don't even know. We have a tractor full. So we have a chicken tractor. It's this mobile coop. And we buy 30 birds at a time. So they arrive when they are 2 days old. They're shipped out the day they're born, and they arrive in the mail. And you take these little darlings out and you dip their beaks in water so they know how to drink. And that's the first food or water they've had since they were born. They've just been living on their resources from the egg. And then you raise them until we're currently doing Cornish cross, which is a very fast growing, very stupid bird that does not live very long. Like normally it's genetically inferior. I mean, they're a hybrid, and they don't live long in the wild. They're not a heritage breed. So they grow really quickly. They put on a lot of gorgeous meat, and then I don't feel as bad killing them. The very first time that we raised chickens, we raised a heritage breed, and it broke my heart to kill them. They had so much personality, and they were so engaging. In fact, we ended up saving 2 of them, and they are now egg layers. We call them Lucky and Camilla.
Okay, I have to ask, what makes a chicken dumb and what makes a chicken have a good personality?
Okay, so those heritage birds were super curious. They would come up and look at you and kind of like engage with you a little bit. They knew how to figure out which water to drink out of, because there are different kinds of waters. There's like a trough water or a nipple water where they have to peck at it, and they could figure that out. If you had the door on the tractor open, they were going to try and get out and escape and go live their happiest life in the wild. Now, these Cornish cross, they're like bowling balls with a little head that just pecks all day long. They will lay in the ground. In fact, with our last batch, that's what we call them, a batch of chickens. Our last batch, it was the super hot summer batch. And again, this was my pandemic panic buying. I bought chickens to raise in Texas in July and August, which was really dumb, but I know that now. So those birds, they just want to sit around. So my daughter accidentally left the tractor door open overnight once with that last batch. And when I went back in the morning, thank goodness no predators had found them, but every single bird was still in that tractor. Every single one just sitting there waiting to be fed. No. So yeah, that's the difference.
That's the difference. So your kids were not raised on a farm. So is it tough for them to all of a sudden have these fantastic pets? Because we did have chicks once through our homeschooling, and it was a blast. And that's what made my kids vegan, because they got to know chickens and absolutely fell in love with them. So did your kids adjust to the notion that now we have a whole bunch of pets, but we're also going to eat them?
Well, I think we made it real clear they weren't pets from the get-go. We told them from the beginning what those animals' purpose was for us. And we helped them understand the economics of how much money we would be saving if we could raise our own chicken meat. They knew we ate chicken, and they understood that the chicken they were eating came from a bird. And I do not have any vegetarians in my family anymore now or ever. So It hasn't affected them the way it affected your family. They get it. In fact, those broiler chickens, they are all named dinner, every single.
Fair.
And when eventually we'll get pigs, and that's going to be bacon and carnitas.
Yeah. What was harder to learn? Was it harder to learn about bees or chickens?
Bees.
Really?
I still have so much to learn about bees. Bees are amazing. Oh my goodness. There's a lot, because when you're inspecting those hives, you have to kind of have a deep understanding of what you're looking at. I'm 2 years in, I don't know what I'm looking at. I can pick out honey cells. I can pick out pollen cells. I can find the queen on occasion. But they're just such a fascinating superorganism, right? Like when they're overcrowded and there's no more room for them to build in their current hive, when a swarm happens, right? The hive will produce a new queen, and the vast majority of bees are female. The only bees that are not female are the drones, and their sole purpose is to crossbreed with other hives to promote genetic diversity in the beehive world, the honeybee world. But all these women have diverse tasks that they learn and grow through over this course of their life cycle. It's fascinating. They might be cleanup bees, they might be guard bees, they might be foraging bees, they might be scout bees, they might be nurse bees, they might be the queen's attendants. And so it's just this complex, fascinating society. And I feel like most of the time I feel like I'm just a trespasser. I feel like I really just want to trust the bees to know what they're doing. At the same time, there are so many environmental pressures right now that they do need support. They need to have a water source, a food source. And we're lucky enough. I mean, we have 5 acres of wildflowers that are, constantly changing. I know what season is in Texas by what is blooming in my yard. And so that's good for my bees. But there are lots of bees that are in a lot of trouble.
Have you actually harvested honey?
It's recommended that you give bees a full year to establish their hives before you attempt to take any honey. So this year was the first year that we would have been able to get honey. And the hive situation was such that they just didn't produce any for us. They produced enough for them to get through the winter. So I'm going to leave that for them. But our honey super did not have any honey in it.
Is that normal?
I don't know. That's my answer all the time with the bees. I feel like I probably know more than most people, but I don't feel like I know anything.
Where did you learn all this?
YouTube. No, YouTube. And then I buy books and I read books, Julie. I don't know if you know that about me, but I like to read.
I do know this about you. Yeah.
Charlie Usuri's book, The Small Scale Poultry Flock, is my favorite. It's stunningly detailed. He's a 1 on the Enneagram, so he's got this belief that he has these strong visions for the world, for a more perfect world, but his visions are all based around chickens, and I just adore him for it. And the whole book has just so much rich detail and good information, and I still aspire to be as dedicated and careful a chicken keeper as he is.
And that's your other great love, of course, that you just skated by, is the Enneagram. What's your favorite Enneagram book?
Probably the Wisdom of the Enneagram by Riso and Hudson.
What is the Enneagram for our listeners who have maybe never heard of it?
So the Enneagram is a personality model that describes 9 distinct personality types with a whole bunch of variations, right? So, and they're numbers 1 through 9. So the ones are the perfectionists, and they're the people who lead with anger, righteous anger, right? Like at their healthiest, they're a John Lewis, they're a Mahatma Gandhi, they're someone holding up a candle to change the world. Idealists, and at their best, they are encouraging us all to take great action. 2s are the helpers. They are full of love and they derive pleasure from helping other people. 3s are the doers, right? They're the performers. They're the ones who believe that what they do is everything. Their work is really important. Their ego pleasure is derived from their achievements, the achiever. Fours are the tragic romantics. They are the individualists of the Enneagram. They tend to be very creative people, and they like finding beauty and meaning in the world. Fives are the thinkers, analysts. They are the observer. They are fonts of information and knowledge, and their ego pleasure comes from being the expert. The sixes are the loyalists. They are great troubleshooters. They are the glue in any community, and they have a fantastic talent for looking ahead and understanding what might threaten their security and the security of their group, and they're really good at defending that. They also are just really hard workers. Sevens are the dilettantes. Sevens are the Peter Pans that just don't want to grow up. They, by that nature, they have that wonderful, exuberant energy of youth and big ideas, and they're often the life of the party. They're a very charismatic number. Eights are the bosses. They are the challenger. They have big energy. And the nines are the counselors, the mediators, the people who are more likely to see other people's perspective than even their own perspective. They are the ones that can bridge gaps.
Does the Enneagram influence a person's reading life? Like, does a certain number tend to be the reader, or can any number be an avid reader?
Any number can be an avid reader, but I think there are some numbers that are more likely to be avid readers.
What is your reading life like?
I read every day. I have for as long as I can remember. I don't remember a time when I couldn't read. I remember my grandmother being just shocked at how quickly I would go through the books she sent me for my birthday. And that's all I ever wanted as a child was books. At one point, my grandmother, who was such a great encourager to me, she sent me the entire Black Stallion series, which I still have on my shelf. And I read it over and over and over again as a child. Nowadays, I have 3 children, and I homeschool my children, and I homestead. If I always read right before bed, and then I've had quite a bit of insomnia over the last 14 years. And so I typically would also get another 2 or 3 hours of reading in between 2 and 5 in the morning, which is ridiculous. But I mean, it's what's kept my reading up. I am someone who likes really big books. I like the big fat fantasies. I like the door stoppers. I love long series. And once I find an author that I love, I will devour absolutely everything in that series, if not in their entire catalog.
Can you tell me what you like so much about fantasy?
I think as a child, I loved fairy tales. My aunt gave me a 2-volume collection of fairy tales that were illustrated with these gorgeous oil paintings by really professional artists. And it felt like I was in this magical world where I wasn't being pandered to with stupid illustrations. These stories were beautifully illustrated. And there were a whole bunch of stories in there that were not in your regular round table of story offerings, right? So there were fairy tales in those books that were my favorites that I haven't encountered anywhere else. I'm certain they exist in other places, but they just aren't part of the standard set. And I think that love of fairy tales grew into a love of fantasy. Like when I saw magical creatures on a cover at Dalton Books at the mall, I was all over that. I love the idea of, I don't know. When my father was alive, he used to talk about a more perfect world a lot. I lived in Germany for a year, and he wrote me a letter every single day. And my favorite parts of those letters were the more perfect world part, where he would wax philosophic a little bit about what we might do to make our society and our world better. And I think that I see that in a fantasy world. I see that desire to make things better. And I like the idea of imagination giving us a portal for progress.
Do you ever pick up a grounded, a domestic trauma, or do you really tend to stick with these alternative worlds?
I read a lot of mystery.
Mm.
I read historical fiction. I read a lot of YA with my kids. I read nonfiction. That's really the bulk of it. I have a degree in English, and I had enough depressing books in college to get me through the rest of my life. I really
Got
did.
it.
I love poetry. I absolutely adore poetry.
Who are some poets you love?
Tess Gallagher, Mary Oliver, Raymond Carver. I mean, I find poetry everywhere.
Mm-hmm. How did you find this book that we're talking today, Deerskin?
I do not remember exactly, but knowing me, I would have read something else by Robin McKinley. I'm going to guess The Blue Sword is probably the one that got me into her. And then I started I will read everything this author has ever written.
Mm-hmm.
And this one is by far my favorite. I love this book.
How many times have you reread this one?
Probably 5 times.
Will you describe the plot for our listeners?
Okay, so this is an adult fairy tale. This is a story that takes a fairy tale and twists it a little. It's the story of the daughter of the most beautiful woman in the 7 kingdoms and her husband. It's almost like it picks up where the happily ever after stops for most fairy tales. And this is what happens to the daughter of the most beautiful woman in all of the 7 kingdoms, and her husband, who is a hero to the people. That description that I've just given to you, we learn to find is a very skin deep description of these people. And we start a story with a very lonely, very neglected princess whose mother is dying, and the kingdom is shocked, and the king loses his mind. And when she gets a little older and begins to look more like her mother, the king, who is certifiable at this point, takes a look at her, having neglected and abandoned her for quite some time, and sees his dead wife and decides that he's going to marry his daughter. And it's this it plunges you into this surreal, oh my God, this can't be happening kind of moment. And we might have had a few of those this year, haven't we, Julie?
We've had a few.
She is terribly traumatized. I don't know how graphic to get, but it's not a pretty story. And when her mother died, she was given the gift of a dog from a neighboring kingdom's prince. And that dog became her bosom companion. And when she is fighting for her life after this trauma that she goes through with her father, it is the dog that helps her back to wanting to live. This story, I think, is a huge, visceral experience of trauma and healing. It is a story about what it is to be human. It's a story about connection. It's a story about perception, what is seen, what is shown, and what is perceived. And I find all of that really fascinating.
It's interesting because most fantasy just leaves me absolutely cold. And I was describing this book to a friend of mine who said, "What are you reading?" And I said, I'm reading this fantasy book, but it's not really fantasy. Well, there are dragons, but they kind of live in the woods and you never really see them. And then I stopped myself and went, okay, it's a fantasy. Like, why am I dodging that word fantasy, even though there are dragons who live in the woods and you kind of don't see them? And I think it's because it felt so realistic, which is a weird thing to say about a book with dragons.
I have been thinking a lot about this because she becomes, so at some point, at a point later in the book, she has all kinds of dogs with her, right? She's got a whole pack that they flow around her like water, right? They're like an extension of her. And she is someone who is driven to help other people, right? She's someone the townspeople see as Moon Woman, and she's the one who finds lost children and connects people and things. She is the female archetype I want to see, not Wonder Woman. I love Wonder Woman, but I don't need another woman in armor with a sword. I need the divine feminine. I need this kind of feminine power in the world, this power of connection, this power of finding and healing.
And I was really fascinated that she was so connected to a dog, which it always seems like the men get the dogs in stories, right? And women always get cats. And men always get dogs. And I loved that she had this pack of dogs spilling out around her all the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's another thing I wouldn't have predicted, liking that whole dog story so much. I'm not a dog person.
I know.
It was so, I actually stopped at one point and went, oh, this is like about an emotional support animal.
She's an amazing writer.
We're going to have to give a trigger warning, I guess, at the beginning of this, because I'm going to address this thing. But there is definitely, it's not a graphic rape scene. And I think if I'd have known that was coming, I might have skipped this and just said, we'll meet and talk, but I'm not going to read it. You're just going to tell me about it. I'm glad I read it anyway. I'm glad I went in not knowing that, although I would feel remiss if I didn't warn people that scene is there. It's very much usually a trigger point for me, but it was not in this book. And I think that's down to the skill of the author, who did not linger on the violence, but lingered a long time on the healing and the strength building afterward.
This is a book that helped me to heal, right? I think, as we know from the Me Too movement, there are a lot of women, more women than we want to admit, who have been raped. This book helped me heal. And I think you're right. I think it is that it doesn't linger in the act. It's you know that it's ugly, but you're not living it moment by moment with her. You are immediately in the aftermath and in the choices that she's making. Do I keep going after this? How do I deal with what has happened, right? And you see distinct phases in what she goes through: fleeing, hiding, finding a way to stay alive, right? To feed herself and reckon with what has happened by shoving it into a closet in her brain. It takes a long time. It's not, I think that's the part of healing that is so disappointing. The trauma can happen in an instant, and the healing can take decades. And I love that as readers, we get to heal alongside this protagonist.
Another thing that I really loved and recognized about the end was, even though it does have what might even be considered a classic fairy tale ending, there is not a sense that everything's gone. It's like it never happened, and now we're just happily ever after. There's very much a sense of this is part of her forever.
Yes.
Not that it ruined her, but that it will never go away.
That is part of the shaping of her character. Yes.
Yeah.
And I when I think about the end of this book, I always think about, like, I love that. I don't know how much we want to give away. It's a fairy tale. Everybody knows how it ends. So the prince, when he was a child, he tells Deerskin that he was in love with Moon Woman, the goddess, right? There's this like layering of myth in this book that's really fascinating to me because she could be the genesis of the Moon Woman story, and yet there was a Moon Woman story before her, and there's clearly other ethereal beings that come into her life at a few key moments. But I love that as a child, he was in love with Moon Woman, but when the entire town and all the surrounding people see her as Moon Woman, he's the only one who sees her as Deerskin, the name that she goes by.
And I loved the very clear distinction between her and her mother. As her mother was dying, all she could think about was only marry someone as beautiful as me. So the beauty was the only point. And then Deerskin, who has the exact beauty, becomes the Moon Woman, becomes this divine feminine myth. And her job then is the well-being of others, the well-being of the lost children, the well-being of these abandoned puppies, her own strength and well-being. And you almost never, it doesn't mention, I was afraid it was going to veer into that, where Prince Osen was going to start talking about she's the most beautiful in 7 kingdoms. And it's not that it's dropped, but it's very much not the focus anymore. Is, oh, guess what? I got the prettiest princess.
No, not at all. I love that. I love the romance in this story because it's not, oh, and they met and they kissed and they fell in love and it was happily ever after. There's a real development of that relationship in this story. And I very much appreciate that. It kind of, it takes all the criticism that we have of fairy tales and kind of just smashes it.
What age would you let your daughters or your kids read this?
I'm weird. I let my kids read whatever they want, whatever they're interested in.
Would you give them a warning?
I don't think this book would come across to them the way it does to you or I. I don't think they have the frame of reference. God, I hope they don't have the frame of reference to make this book as powerful as it was to me. Somebody else's kid, I would say, look, it's got this in it, and judge accordingly how old you think your kids should be. Different kids mature at different ages, right?
Sure.
I would maybe start my 9-year-old with something different from Robin's catalog.
What should I read next from her?
I mean, you've already read my favorite, so... Do you like vampire stories?
I mean, I like the original. I like Dracula, I think. I don't know. I haven't read it since college. Maybe I don't like it anymore.
I think Sunshine is probably one that's closest to this book in terms of sensibility. It's a more adult book.
Well, I am delighted to have read it, and I'm delighted that you chose it. Would you say this is a good introduction into the world of fantasy for people like me who have very little experience with the genre of fantasy? Is this a good starting point?
I mean, to this day, I think the genre still has this perception of, when you think of fantasy, you think of Lord of the Rings, you think of The Wheel of Time, you think of, all these big epic stories. It's like saying, is this representative of America? Fantasy is really diverse, right? So I wouldn't say it's representative. I love it when I find a strong female voice in fantasy. I'm not a black and white thinker, so I can't say yes, this is, or no, this isn't on that.
Okay. But if you like this book and you're not familiar with fantasy, who are some other authors that you might recommend?
Robin Hobb, for sure. If you like this, giant character-driven, Outlander. The Outlander series is fantasy.
Oh, yeah.
If the idea of wizards throwing magic missiles and giant dragons flying through the sky is a little more than your suspension of disbelief can handle, then something like Outlander. I know, Rosamund Hodge, Crimson Bound by Rosamund Hodge. That was also really good because it was a fairy tale I was not familiar with. And so it had that, it was delightful. It wasn't like I didn't know what was coming as readily as I might in a retelling of Beauty and the Beast or a retelling of Cinderella or Snow White.
Oh, okay. Oh, that sounds good.
So, yeah, I'm recognizing, even as a child, my favorite fairy tales were always the ones where the princess had some kind of agency.
So, Alyssa, tell me what you're reading now.
I'm reading The Seer of Seven Waters by Juliette Marillier. The first book in the series was recommended to me. It is an adult fairy tale. It's a retelling of The Seven Swans. And now I'm 6 books later, and there's no more fairy tale. This is just the ongoing story of this family, and it's just lovely. I'm really enjoying it.
So she started with one fairy tale, retold it, and then created an entire series out of the one story?
So the first book is the retelling. The second book starts with a story from the following generation, from the characters in the next generation. And then the third book, I believe, is the third generation. And now we're dealing with siblings and other people's stories.
Oh my God, that's the best idea. You know what that makes me think is, you know what book I want to read is Belle and the Beast's Kid. Because that's a story. How'd you meet, Mom and Dad? Oh, Dad kidnapped me and imprisoned me inside a library. But, I super love him anyway because of the library. So that's going to be a messed up kid. I want that story.
Yes. Yes.
Can you tell it was not fun telling me fairy tales when I was a kid? All right. Well, why don't you tell our listeners all the places they can find you online?
Okay. So I write cozy mysteries under the name Lucy Jackson. So those are Texas Hill Country cozy mysteries. The first one is Murder, She Goat by Lucy Jackson. And you can find
recipes.
With recipes. That's right. You can find those on Amazon. And I have audiobooks that are available.
Alyssa, this has been so fun talking to you. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening, bookworms. For more information on this episode and links to everything we discussed, please go to our website, bestbookeverpodcast.com, or follow us on Instagram at bestbookeverpodcast. I'm your host, Julie Strauss, and you can find me everywhere as Julie Wrote a Book. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review on whatever podcatcher you use. Reviews really help our visibility to new listeners, and we are so grateful for everyone. If you want access to exclusive content, including extra interview time with our guests, advance notice of the books we're going to discuss, monthly curated book selections, and more, go to patreon.com/bestbookever. That's patreon.com/bestbookever to support us. Your financial support really helps with the expenses of running this podcast. Thanks for joining me today, and I will see you at the library.